August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. As dawn rose over the Pacific, 11,000 United States Marines came ashore in what would become the first large-scale Allied assault against the Empire of Japan. Operation Watchtower signaled a decisive turning point in the Pacific campaign. Yet beyond the naval clashes and jungle fighting that ensued, an unexpected weapon surfaced in the thick darkness along the island's perimeter, one founded not on steel or explosives, but on the basic architecture of human speech itself. The challenge was immediate and deadly serious. In the confusion of jungle warfare, where visibility shrank to a few feet amid tangled tropical growth, and where the enemy sometimes spoke English and wore captured American uniforms, how could sentries at checkpoints tell friend from foe, or recognize Japanese infiltrators trying to slip through under cover of night? The solution came from an unlikely source: the pronunciation of a single letter. Master Technical Sergeant James W. Herbert, a combat correspondent with the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve, landed with the assault troops on August 7th. In a March 10, 1943 interview preserved in Naval Archives, Herbert gave first-hand testimony about the security procedure that became standard practice during the campaign. His account remains the clearest primary evidence we have regarding pronunciation tests in the Pacific Theater. "We always had passwords including the letter L," Herbert explained, because L was believed to be difficult for the Japanese to pronounce, as there's no L in their vocabulary. This simple insight reflected a surprisingly sophisticated grasp of linguistic constraints that proved invaluable to American defenses throughout the operation. Herbert also pointed out one crucial flaw that revealed its practical limits. The test occasionally failed with Japanese soldiers educated in English, suggesting that Marines were confronting infiltrators with varying linguistic proficiency, and that while the measure was effective, it was not infallible. By 1600 hours, 4 p.m., on August 8th, Marines had seized the nearly finished Japanese airstrip. Originally designated Lunga Airfield by its builders, it was renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. The strip became operational when the first PBY Catalina flying boat landed on August 12th, and by August 20th, a permanent air group arrived with 31 aircraft. Control of this field soon became the centerpiece of the entire 6-month struggle, as Japanese forces launched repeated efforts to reclaim it. Security around Henderson Field and the defensive perimeter was of utmost importance. Japanese troops, showing the tactical adaptability and persistence that defined their campaigns across the Pacific, attempted numerous infiltration missions. They crept through the jungle at night, sometimes in small squads, sometimes alone, seeking to collect intelligence, sabotage equipment, or mislead American units. Nighttime conditions made such efforts particularly perilous. Sentries posted at outposts had to make instantaneous judgments about whether shadowy figures approaching were friendly Marines or hostile infiltrators. Conventional identification methods often failed. Documents could be captured or forged, uniforms taken from the dead, and faces were impossible to discern in darkness. Even voices were unreliable as some Japanese soldiers spoke English with varying fluency. The Marines needed a test that could not be easily imitated, something that exposed identity through traits an infiltrator could not consciously disguise. The answer lay in exploiting the phonological structure of the Japanese language. To grasp why this technique worked so well, one must examine the fundamental contrasts between Japanese and English sound systems. Japanese contains only one liquid consonant, represented in standard Hepburn romanization as R, but pronounced quite differently from either, the English R or L sound linguistically. This Japanese liquid is classified as an echo-alveola, tap represented in the International Phonetic Alphabet as R native Japanese speakers produce this sound by quickly tapping the tongue against the alveolar ridge, the area just behind the upper front teeth. English, by contrast, has two distinct liquid phonemes. The English L sound is a lateral approximant produced by placing the tongue tip firmly against the alveolar ridge while allowing air to flow around the sides of the tongue. The American English R sound is quite different, typically produced as a postal viola approximate with the tongue pulled back and not touching the roof of the mouth at all. These two English sounds occupy distinctly different positions in the phonetic space, easily distinguished by native English speakers, but falling within a single perceptual category for Japanese speakers. This philological difference is not a matter of physical inability or hearing impairment. Japanese speakers can physically produce both English sounds with proper training, and they can hear the acoustic differences between them when sounds are presented in isolation. The difficulty is perceptual and categorical. The Japanese language processes both English sounds through a single phonetic category established during early childhood language acquisition. When Japanese speakers hear English Randell sounds in actual speech, their brains automatically categorize both sounds as instances of the single Japanese liquid phone. Research conducted during and after World War II confirmed this phenomenon. Studies by Guto in 1971, Miyake and colleagues in 1975, and Takagi and Manin 1995 documented that Japanese speakers struggled to perceive the English R and L distinction even after extended exposure to English. Takagi and Mann found that Japanese speakers who had lived in the United States for more than 12 years still had significantly more difficulty identifying R and L sounds than native English speakers. The 1975 Milwaukee study revealed something particularly relevant to the wartime application. When researchers manipulated recordings of R and L sounds to make them sound less speech-like by removing certain acoustic information, Japanese speakers could distinguish them as well as native English speakers. This proved that the difficulty was not in hearing the acoustic differences, but in how the brain processed those differences as linguistic sounds. For military security purposes, this linguistic reality meant that Japanese soldiers attempting infiltration faced a nearly insurmountable obstacle. Even soldiers who had studied English extensively, who might know vocabulary and grammar, who could maintain a conversation in English, would betray themselves through pronunciation of words containing L sounds. The pronunciation was not under conscious control. Under stress, fatigue, or time pressure, automatic native language, pronunciation patterns would emerge regardless of the infiltrator's intentions or preparation. The effectiveness of this approach relies on how humans acquire language during early childhood when the brain develops. Perceptual categories for native language sounds that remain remarkably stable throughout life and resist modification even with extensive adult training. The Marines implemented this knowledge through challenge words containing multiple L sounds. According to Hurlbut's testimony and available documentation, passwords systematically incorporated the letter L specifically because Japanese speakers would struggle to pronounce it correctly. When a sentry challenged an approaching figure with a password containing L sounds, a native English speaker would pronounce it automatically and correctly. A Japanese speaker, even one with good English, would typically substitute sounds closer to the Japanese liquid, producing something that sounded distinctly wrong to the trained ear of the century. One specific word has entered the historical record, though it comes from a single source. Oliver Garling, a journalist with the Associated Press, published "Free Men Are Fighting the Story of World War II in 1942 with Farrand Reinhardt." On page 315, Garling wrote that Japanese soldiers would sometimes approach checkpoints posing as American or Filipino military personnel. He stated that sentries would use a shibboleth such as Lollapalooza, and if the first two syllables come back as roar, the sentry would open fire without waiting to har the remainder. The word Lollapalooza represents an ideal choice for this purpose if it was indeed an American slang term meaning something outstanding or extraordinary. It contains 4 L sounds in rapid succession at the beginning of syllables, Lola La Parua. For a Japanese speaker, each of these L sounds would present difficulty, making it virtually impossible to pronounce the word correctly without extensive training. The instruction to listen specifically to the first 2 syllables makes tactical sense as well. A sentry would not need to wait for the complete password to identify mispronunciation, reducing exposure time during the challenge. However, we must be precise about the evidence. Garling's book remains the only known reference to Lulua specifically. Published in 1942, it was contemporary with the events it described, and Garling himself was regarded as a credible journalist with access to military information. However, no independent verification appears in official Marine Corps after-action reports, operational histories, or other memoirs from participants. Richard Tregascus, Guadalcanal Diary, published in 1943 and based on his service as a war correspondent on the island, makes no mention of the term. Robert Leckey's memoir, Helmet for My Pillow, and other first-hand accounts also omit any reference to it. What can be stated with confidence is that L-based passwords were used systematically, as confirmed by Herbert's direct testimony. Whether Lollapalooza was among those passwords remains possible but not conclusively established. The word fits. The tactical needs appears in a contemporary account and aligns with documented practices, but further corroboration would strengthen the case. The 6-month campaign lasted from August 7, 1942 to February 9, 1943, when Japanese forces finally evacuated their remaining troops from the island. During this time, the Marines and later Army reinforcements faced relentless pressure from Japanese efforts to retake the airfield. Major engagements included the Battle of the Tanaru on August 21st, the Battle of Edson's Ridge from September 12th to 14th, and the Battle for Henderson Field from October 23rd to 26th. Throughout these battles and the lulls between them, maintaining security around the American perimeter was crucial. Japanese infiltration tactics were well documented. Enemy soldiers, often moving in small units or alone, attempted to slip through American lines under cover of darkness. They used exceptional camouflage, sometimes fastening jungle vegetation to their uniforms. They moved with remarkable stealth across terrain they had studied in detail. Some spoke English, and there were recorded instances of Japanese troops attempting to pose as American personnel. The threat was continuous and deadly. Herbert also mentioned in his interview an intriguing additional security cue. On at least one occasion, a sentry detected Japanese infiltrators because they used language that sounded far too formal for a typical Marine. One infiltrator allegedly called out, "Hold your fire. We are American Marines and wish to report our evening's activities," prompting the sentry to shoot immediately, because I knew no Marine would talk that way. In this setting, pronunciation testing became a reliable method of identifying infiltrators without relying on visual confirmation, identification papers, or lengthy dialogue. A simple challenge using a word with an L sound could unmask an infiltrator in seconds. The test worked because it exploited something nearly impossible to fake: the automatic speech patterns formed in early language learning. The term shibboleth itself originates from the Hebrew Bible, in Judges 12:5-6, where the Gileadites identified enemy Ephraimites by their inability to pronounce a specific word. The Ephraimites said Sibboleth without the shech sound, revealing their identity. Comparable linguistic tests have appeared throughout military history whenever forces needed to distinguish allies from enemies using language as a dependable marker. The D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, applied a different linguistic principle for the same purpose. The challenge and password system used flash as the challenge, thunder as the password, and welcome as the countersign. These words were chosen because they contained sounds difficult for German speakers to reproduce: the voiceless dental, fricative thief in thunder, absent in German, and the voiced labial approximant W in welcome, also missing from standard German phonology. This parallel use of linguistic shibboleths in the European theater illustrates that military planners understood the tactical value of exploiting phonological differences for security. Other English sounds that posed difficulty for Japanese speakers included the V sound, absent in Japanese and typically replaced with B, the TH sounds, both voiced and voiceless, and the complex English vowel system, which far exceeds the 5 simple vowels of Japanese. Security-conscious password selection could exploit any of these distinctions, though the LR difference appears to have been the most frequently employed based on surviving testimony. The wider context of wartime security measures in the Pacific provides further insight. American forces across the region faced continual problems of infiltration, deception, and the difficulty of identifying friend from foe under conditions where visual confirmation was often impossible. The challenge and password system, a long-standing military practice, became even more vital in the Pacific due to several unique factors. First, the dense jungle environment reduced visibility drastically. Thick vegetation, heavy rain, and the frequent use of night operations by Japanese troops force sentries to rely on sound and verbal exchanges alone. Second, Japanese doctrine emphasized infiltration, night attacks, and confusion-based tactics. The challenge and password system itself was simple in concept. A sentry issued a challenge word, and the approaching individual responded with the correct password. If the response was wrong or absent, the sentry acted accordingly. The system's effectiveness depended on several things: frequent changes to prevent compromise, secure distribution to friendly units, and, ideally, the inclusion of words difficult for enemy speakers to pronounce. The Military Intelligence Service Language School, MASOS, offers an instructive counterpoint to the pronunciation test story. Founded on November 1, 1941, at the Presidio of San Francisco, the school relocated to Camp Savage, Minnesota in June 1942 following Executive Order 9066, which led to the internment of Japanese Americans along the West Coast. It later moved to Fort Snelling, Minnesota in August 1944 and operated until June 1946. The MISLAS trained over 6,000 Japanese American soldiers as translators, interpreters, and intelligence specialists during the war. These Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, served throughout the Pacific, providing critical language support for interrogations, document translation, and intelligence operations. The contribution of these Japanese American linguists was essential to Allied success in the Pacific. They interrogated prisoners, translated captured documents, intercepted and translated radio communications, and provided cultural insights that helped commanders understand Japanese military thinking. Their service was particularly notable, given that many of their families were confined in internment camps while they fought for the United States. For pronunciation testing purposes, these Japanese American soldiers would have passed any L-based challenge automatically. They spoke English with native pronunciation, having acquired the language during childhood in American communities. Their presence in the Pacific Theater, while invaluable for intelligence work, also meant that security forces needed to be aware that Japanese ethnicity did not automatically indicate enemy status. Private First Class Eugene B. Sledge provides one of the few verified personal accounts from an individual who served in the Pacific Theater and later documented his experiences. Sledge enlisted in the Marines and served with K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. He participated in the battles of Peleliu and Okinawa, fighting in some of the most intense combat of the Pacific War. His memoir With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa, published in 1981, became recognized as one of the finest first-person accounts of infantry combat. While Sledge did not serve at Guadalcanal during the campaign, he arrived there in 1944 for training after the fighting had concluded. His book does not specifically mention pronunciation testing, focusing instead on the brutal realities of combat, the psychological toll of sustained fighting, and the experiences of Marine infantrymen in the Pacific. The absence of extensive discussion of pronunciation testing in most combat memoirs is itself informative. If the practice was as systematic and elaborate as some popular accounts suggest, we would expect more frequent mentions in the dozens of memoirs written by veterans. The relative silence suggests that while LB-aced passwords were used, as Hellblut confirms, the practice may have been more limited or routine than later accounts implied, Security procedures that work effectively often become unremarkable to those using them daily. The eventual Allied victory came at significant cost. American forces suffered approximately 7,100 killed and over 8,000 wounded. Japanese casualties were much higher, with estimates of approximately 31,000 killed, many from disease and starvation, as American naval and air forces interdicted Japanese supply efforts. The successful Japanese evacuation in February 1943 saved approximately 10,000 Japanese troops who were later deployed elsewhere, but the strategic defeat was clear. Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific and would never regain it. The limitations of pronunciation testing should also be acknowledged. As Herbert noted, it sometimes failed with English-educated Japanese. Any Japanese individual who had spent childhood years in an English-speaking environment would have acquired native Ike pronunciation and could pass LB-ACE tests. Japanese intelligence services were aware of this advantage and occasionally employed individuals with English background for intelligence operations. Additionally, in the chaos of combat with artillery fire, explosions, and shouting, subtle pronunciation differences might be difficult to detect reliably. The test also carried risks of false positives. American forces in the Pacific included soldiers from diverse backgrounds, including Filipino scouts and soldiers, Chinese Americans, and others whose English might carry non-standard pronunciations or accents. Security procedures needed to account for legitimate variation in English pronunciation among Allied forces. The phonological differences between Filipino languages and Japanese meant that Filipino English speakers typically had no difficulty with eel and ear sounds, as these phonemes exist in Tagalog and other Philippine languages, but their English might sound different from American pronunciation in other ways. Despite these limitations, pronunciation testing based on L sounds represented an elegant solution to a genuine security problem. It exploited real philological differences, required no special equipment, could be administered quickly, and provided a reasonable basis for identification when other methods were unavailable or unreliable. The test worked because it accessed something fundamental about language acquisition: the fact that phonological patterns established during early childhood remain remarkably stable throughout life and are difficult to modify even with extensive training and conscious effort. The story of pronunciation testing serves multiple purposes today. For historians, it provides insight into the practical details of security operations during the Pacific War. For linguists, it illustrates real-world applications of philological knowledge. For general audiences, it offers a fascinating example of how language itself can become a tool in warfare. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us to be careful about historical claims and to distinguish between well-documented facts and later embellishments. The verified core of the story is clear and compelling. American forces at Guadalcanal used passwords containing L sounds to help identify Japanese infiltrators who would struggle to pronounce those sounds correctly. This practice was documented by participants makes excellent sense given the philological differences between Japanese and English and represented practical innovation in the face of genuine security challenges. The specific word Lalua appears in one contemporary source and fits the pattern perfectly, though independent corroboration would strengthen the claim. Beyond this verified core, many popular accounts have added details that cannot be confirmed, invented statistics that appear nowhere in historical records, and attribution of the practice to a systematic Pacific-wide program for which no documentation exists. These embellishments, while making for dramatic storytelling, distort the historical record and create false impressions about the nature and extent of pronunciation testing. The honest history based solely on verified evidence is remarkable enough without embellishment. It shows American forces adapting to the challenges of jungle warfare, exploiting linguistic differences to improve security, and innovating at the tactical level to address immediate threats. It demonstrates the value of observation, practical intelligence, and willingness to try new approaches. And it provides a window into the daily realities of combat operations in the Pacific Theater, where security, identification, and the constant threat of infiltration created persistent challenges for American forces. The Marines who developed and implemented pronunciation testing deserve recognition for their practical innovation. While the broader context of the campaign reminds us of the human cost of war and the complexity of military operations, the Japanese-American linguists who served in the Pacific, often while their families remained in internment camps, demonstrated loyalty and professionalism under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Their contribution to victory was essential, and their story adds depth and nuance to our understanding of the Pacific War. In conclusion, the verified historical record shows that American Marines at Guadalcanal systematically used passwords containing L sounds to help identify Japanese infiltrators. This practice, directly testified by combat correspondent James Halbut, exploited real philological differences between Japanese and English. The word Lollapalooza appears in one credible 1942 source as an example of such passwords. While broader claims about systematic Pacific-wide testing cannot be verified, the documented use at Guadalcanal demonstrates practical tactical innovation that addressed genuine security challenges. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal, including security procedures like pronunciation testing, informed American operations throughout the rest of the Pacific War. Each subsequent campaign saw improvements in tactics, logistics, and operational coordination. The amphibious assaults that followed from Tarawa through the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa built on the foundation of experience gained at Guadalcanal. While we cannot document pronunciation testing at these later battles with the same certainty as at Guadalcanal, the principle of exploiting language differences for security purposes remained sound. The scientific understanding of phonology and language acquisition that explained why pronunciation testing worked came later, through research conducted during and after the war. But the Marines at Guadalcanal did not need to understand the linguistic theory to recognize that Japanese speakers had difficulty with English L sounds and that this difficulty could be used to identify infiltrators. This represents the best kind of practical knowledge, observations derived from experience and applied to solve immediate problems. The broader implications of this wartime application extend beyond military history. The recognition that language features can serve as reliable identifiers has influenced security procedures in subsequent conflicts. During the Vietnam War, American forces used similar principles, though adapted to different linguistic contrasts. In more recent conflicts, linguistic analysis has become increasingly sophisticated, incorporating voice stress analysis and dialect identification technologies that extend well beyond simple pronunciation testing. The ethical dimensions of pronunciation testing merit consideration as well. Unlike some security measures that relied on deception or caused physical harm, pronunciation testing was essentially diagnostic. It identified linguistic background without causing harm beyond the security consequences of failed identification. Soldiers who passed the test suffered no effects. Those who failed it were identified as potential infiltrators, not through arbitrary discrimination, but through objective phonetic evidence that they lacked the linguistic background they claimed. This relatively benign nature of the testing, compared to more violent or coercive security measures, meant that it remained acceptable within the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. The test also highlights an important principle about identity and ethnicity. Japanese Americans serving in the Pacific, such as those with the Military Intelligence Service, passed pronunciation tests automatically because their linguistic identity was American, regardless of their ethnic heritage. This demonstrated that pronunciation testing was fundamentally a measure of language background rather than ethnicity or race. It was the correlation between Japanese citizenship and Japanese language background, not ethnicity itself, that made the testing effective for identifying enemy infiltrators. This distinction, while perhaps not fully articulated during the war, had important implications for understanding the relationship between language, identity, and security. The human dimension of the Guadalcanal campaign extends beyond tactics and security measures. The men who fought there, both American and Japanese, displayed courage, determination, and adaptability in one of the most difficult campaigns of the war. The Americans who developed and implemented pronunciation testing deserve recognition for their practical innovation. The Japanese soldiers who faced these measures were themselves skilled and determined fighters operating under extremely difficult conditions, fighting thousands of miles from home with increasingly tenuous supply lines. The post-war research into the phonetic phenomena that made pronunciation testing effective has enriched our understanding of how humans acquire and process language. Linguists and cognitive scientists, many of whom had served in military intelligence during the war, conducted extensive studies of second language pronunciation acquisition. Research by linguists like Patricia Kuland, others demonstrated that infants are born with the ability to distinguish phonetic contrasts from any human language, but that this universal ability narrows during the first year of life as the brain specializes for the phonetic categories of the native language. This neural commitment to native phonetic categories, while essential for efficient language processing, creates exactly the kind of limitations that made pronunciation testing effective during the war. Adult Japanese speakers attempting to master the English L and R sounds were not merely learning new ways to articulate speech. They were striving to retrain neural perception systems that had been fixed since childhood, a process modern cognitive science shows to be extremely challenging and often impossible to perfect entirely. The pronunciation testing employed during World War II later influenced linguistic research on the idea of the foreign accent. Before the war, accented speech was often regarded simply as incorrect pronunciation that could be corrected through repetition and instruction. Post-war studies revealed that a foreign accent reflects deep-seated structural differences in how sounds are processed, rather than superficial mistakes. This insight led to more advanced methods of language teaching and to recognition that adult learners, no matter their diligence, almost always retain traces of their native phonetic patterns. For military security, this meant pronunciation testing remained a practical identification tool in future conflicts where linguistic contrasts between opposing forces could be exploited. The same principle has appeared in later wars. Though modern technology has added tools such as voice stress analysis and linguistic profiling, which go far beyond simple pronunciation checks. The example of Technical Sergeant Paul Yamamoto, a name not verifiable through surviving records but symbolic of the many Japanese Americans who served, illustrates the complex moral and linguistic dimensions of pronunciation. Testing during a conflict in which Americans of Japanese ancestry fought loyally while their families were interned. These Nisei soldiers, raised speaking English, proved that linguistic identity could transcend ethnicity. Conversely, Japanese infiltrators revealed through their non-native articulation that language identity depends on early linguistic experience, not race. By the summer of 1945, preparations were underway for what many feared would be the final and bloodiest phase of the Pacific War, an invasion of the Japanese home. Islands would have placed American troops in an environment where infiltration was even harder to detect. Enemy forces would have access to abundant local resources, civilian attire, and potential support from the population. In such conditions, reliable identification systems would have been absolutely essential. Plans were drawn up for a comprehensive security framework combining pronunciation testing with documentation checks, physical identifiers, and restricted movement zones. Strategists anticipated that some Japanese individuals, especially those exposed to English in youth or with exceptional linguistic skill, might still pass pronunciation tests. Therefore, multi-layered verification was designed to ensure redundant protection against even advanced infiltration attempts. These measures were never fully executed due to Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they represented the culmination of years of development in linguistic security tactics. The post-war release of previously classified materials offered historians a clearer picture of Pacific War operations, including the planning, adaptation, and success of various security procedures. Documentation specific to pronunciation testing, however, remained limited, largely confined to Herbert's testimony and Garling's reference. The episode underscores that military success often depends on numerous small innovations born of necessity and ingenuity. The realization that linguistic differences could be harnessed for identification showed both practical intelligence and tactical adaptability. The systematic use of L-based passwords at Guadalcanal, though perhaps less elaborate than later stories suggest, represented a genuine and creative solution to a pressing security issue. Today, the story of pronunciation testing at Guadalcanal endures as a modest but meaningful chapter in the broader history of the Pacific War. It highlights how language, the most human of tools, can become a weapon of strategy. It demonstrates how recognizing linguistic contrasts can yield tactical advantages, and how success in warfare often arises from a union of grand strategy and small, field-level innovations devised by soldiers confronting immediate dangers. A careful and honest reading of the historical record reveals both the effectiveness and limitations of pronunciation testing as a security measure. It succeeded at Guadalcanal, offering sentries a quick and dependable way to identify infiltrators. It was logical given the linguistic realities of Japanese and English sound systems, but it was not flawless, not universal across the Pacific, and not as intricate as some later accounts claim. By recognizing what the evidence truly shows and acknowledging its limits, we both honor the Marines who fought and preserved the intellectual integrity that serious history demands. The Marines at Guadalcanal faced enormous challenges in one of America's first major offensives of the Pacific Campaign. Their creativity in developing practical security measures, alongside their courage in battle and determination in defending Henderson Field, contributed to a turning point. Victory that reshaped the war. The core of the story remains compelling. American forces leveraged the fundamental differences in how Japanese and English speakers produce and perceive liquid consonants to create a security tool that was simple, effective, and difficult to counterfeit. This application of linguistic insight, whether born from conscious study or intuitive observation, embodied precisely the kind of practical innovation that helped secure Allied triumph in the Pacific.